Surah 58. There is no reason to doubt the traditional occasion of the passage with which this surah begins. The date, however, is not so certain. The incident is said to have taken place after the return from Hudaybiyah, but in 33:4, the nullity of the pagan formula has already been implied. Pagan is not the right word, but the misassociators came up with their own tradition. Or one would expect this to be earlier. This would bring the date of the passage more in line with that of the bulk of the surah, although some passages in it, particularly verses 12 to 14, are probably later than Hudaybiyah. The secret cabals among the Prophet's followers belong most naturally to the time shortly after Uhud, but the verses dealing with them belong evidently to different dates. If the people with whom Allah is angry refers to the Jews, the passage 15, 17, 19 will also date from not long after Uhud and be connected with the expulsion of the Bani Nadir. It has, however, been, with a later date which can't be determined, though there seems to be some relation between the form and Surah 63, 1 through 8. Oh, well, I guess we'll get to that in this program, but which is usually placed about the year 6, verse 6 and 7, which, while they're in the right position, but, have also some relation to the end of the surah. They are sometimes said to refer to the day of the trench, but the language suggests an earlier date, and those who obstruct Allah, Allah being the singular and definitive term for God, seem to have been in Medina. The reference is perhaps the overthrow of the Bani Nadir. The designation may have been later transformed to the hypocrites, and the verse is discarded in the favor of verse 21 and 22. Surat al-Mujadala, the chapter of the disputant, in the name of Allah, the merciful, compassionate. There's a penalty for using the misassociating formula of divorce, the divorce by insult, basically. And this is the first 4 verses here. Oh, wait, no, verse 7 verses. The wife of Aus bin Asamet, who had been divorced by the use of the formula, comparing her to the mother as something unlawful. On appeal to the Prophet, he declared that the divorce was valid, but she pressed the matter and appealed to Allah, with the result here given. And the people who use the same formula again, that formula of divorce. And there's another note here. They can retract what they said, but here the reference is in the future, warning people, hey, don't do this stuff in the future, because now we know very explicitly. Now, some people would have known long before some of these specific examples were laid forward, but some people wouldn't. That's why we need all our excuse for doing wrong removed. It's a burden sometimes, but it's a fulfilling burden. It's better than wallowing in ignorance, and it feels better too. Or that's not quite the term, but you know what I mean. Secret conclaves against among the Prophet's followers after Uhud, but of various dates. Allah is present at them all. Verse 8 and 8, persistence in them despite the prohibition. Verse 9, and the forbidden reference is related to verse 11. The conversation in them should be pious, at the same time as perhaps originally stood for. Verse 8, so we got verse 10 there. So don't worry about some secret societies or whatever, and that somehow being wrong in itself. No, it's not that simple. They are entirely disapproved of later than verse 8 and 9. So you got to be careful. but they said that they already have the exception. It's not entirely disapproved of when they say, oh, well, if there's good character and piety as part of it, then, you know, like if they wear a symbol, if they wear a leather apron representing modesty and, you know, different stuff. But conduct, well, I mean, I'm not saying that Islam is recommending that. I'm just saying it's just, you know, conduct in the Prophet's Majlis, you know, the place of the learning, fairly late, verse 12, private interviews with the Prophet, verse 13, 14, friendship between hypocrites and the Jews after Hudud, 15 through 20, opponents to be abased, same time as preceding, verse 21, friendly relations to be broken off, verse 22. Well, we have this, the brothers verse, you could say, you know, because that Gemini thing is Castor and Pollux, really brothers as much as anything. But that card can have those, that verse and the other verse from the previous chapter. I think it's the previous chapter, or is it the next one? Satan prevails, chapter 4, verse 140, you know, because they forgot, because they weren't part of the remembrance of God, and then other things come in. Verse 11, what is verse 11 tied to? Well, you make room in the assembly, you know, the assemblies. The word in the other verse, the synagogue, is beyond that, you know, it's beyond that term of assembly. It's the spiritual oratory places, ritual centers or something. So you come closer anyways. But I don't, where's that first note? There's a note here. Oh, the forbidden to converse privately together, much like verse 11. Yeah, you don't just have private groupings to have private groupings. Surah 59. This surah, for the most part, has reference to the expulsion of the Jews from Medina, as usually taken as referring to the Beni Nadir, but verse 2 is long for its context, and verse 2, 3, 4, and 7 have a different rhyme from the rest. These verses must have reference to the Beni Qainuqa, the first of the Jewish tribes to be expelled. The end of the year 2, the deliverance was altered and extended after the expulsion of the Nadir, beginning of year 4, and a different disposition of the spoil was made, verse 6, 8 through 10, the earlier 1 and 7 being, well, it's not discarded because it's there. Verse 8 through 20 probably followed this as an incentive to good Muslimin to accept the disposition made. Verse 11 through 17 date from before the attack on the Nadir and show quite well how Muhammad gauged the situation beforehand. Verse 15 would make quite a good close to the passage, and verse 16 and 17 would stand better after verse 12 than in their present position. Well, why, if it matches completely there? But as we see, he's done a lot of attempts to reorder. Possibly the passage was private. No, there's no evidence of any Muhammad ever kept, you know, the revelation secret until it seemed convenient or something. And 13 to 15 overriding 16 and 17 when it was recited to his followers. The close of the surah, verses 22 to 24, seem to have been some relation to verse 1. The position of 21 is uncertain. It connects best with 22 to 24 and may have stood between verse 1 and these verses if they were originally joined. But more probably it is a detached verse whose presence is due to the space required for the writing of verses 18 to 20. Al-Hashr, the chapter of the roundup. The glory of God, the first 4 verses. Roundup being said, the word hashara in the Qur'an is generally eschatological in use and expresses the rounding up or gathering of men to the judgment. You know, humans, men, we're using the gender neutral plural, right? the phrase was probably omitted when the passage was repeated. No, we find it stuff, but anyways, Muhammad is intended to put them to death, but spared them at the intercession of Abdullah bin Ubay. And well, you know, when people were captured in war, there was advice given, and it was left to some of the people what was going to be done, because either one would have been right. The siege of Beni Nadir was brought to an end with the destruction of palm trees. But the camel and the horse left alone. Verse 5, the spoil was not taken by fighting, but as the result of God's suggestion to destroy the palm plantations. Those emigrated from Mecca to Medina with the Prophet are the immigrants. And Surah 3, ayat 160. Relates to those that played the hypocrite. But the destination of the spoil, verse 7, and 5 was part of that opening bit. The destination of the spoil, verse 6 and 8. Oh, I guess that connects to the brother thing. The hypocrites will not combine with the Jews. That's mentioned before the attack. So to verse 16, oh, maybe 17. Okay, it is 17. Admonition to the believers, 18 through 20. The glory of Allah, 22 to 24. And let's see these notes here. Come after them, the later immigrants and those who supported them. And people turning their backs, the Beni Qaynuqa. And before their coming, there's a reference to the Medinans who had believed before the Hijra, had received and supported the immigrants. And the Islamic State was made possible by those who spread the word that were believers, even though it was mostly people who did not accept the religious authority of Islam that made Yathrib become Madinat Nabi. You know, it was, you know, sort of a democratic choosing. You know, it wasn't Muhammad came in and conquered or anything like that. It's that the people needed a new leader, and there was competition and whatnot. And then people called forth and said, hey, they've chosen Muhammad, and Muhammad comes, and, you know, and they greet him and all that. Importance of the Qur'an, context uncertain, but early Medinan, 21. The glory of Allah, okay, 22 to 24. Verse 16 and 17, maybe a earlier part of the passage, but it wasn't replaced by 13 through 15. It was, but 13 through 15 never was the ending. Neither was 16 and 17. To the morrow, you know, look forward, because you've, as far as you've sent the right things. And so we have all these names of God, the giver's security, the tyrant. But the tyrant, no, what does it say there? Well, it just has the compelling ability. Doesn't mean that God is tyrant, implies something unjust, but God is the justly proud, and so there's 17 names there. Surah 60, whether the traditional occasion of verse 1 to 3 be accepted or not, it's likely that Muhammad did issue some such deliverance after the treaty with Mecca had broken down, but the length of verse 1, and rather the structure of it make it suspect that it was based on some earlier form. Verse 13, which stands isolated at the end of the surah, was probably also connected with the passage and may at some time have been used as the introduction to it, making it refer to the Jews. Verse 2 perhaps is more appropriate to them than to the Meccans. An example of Abraham, verse 4 to 6, would hardly been appealed to at so late a stage if it had not stood in some earlier connection. Verse 7 through 9 are appropriate to the situation just before the expedition to Mecca. Muhammad no doubt knew that the way was being prepared and that the expedition might end in a peaceful settlement. Verse 10, 11, and 12 fall somewhere between the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and the expedition to Mecca. Verse 12 lays down the conditions very similar to those actually exacted at Mecca, but they have been formulated before that. It is to be noticed that these verses need not be taken as applying to the Meccans in particular, but by that time, no doubt, refugees were coming in from other parts of Arabia. Surat al-Mumtahana, chapter the examinee, relation with enemies, to be broken off before final expedition against Mecca, but probably with earlier basis. Verse 1 to 3, an example of Abraham, same time as 1 through 3, perhaps 4, expanded from it, 4 to 6. The possibility of reconciliation before the expedition to Mecca, verse 7, 8, 9, how women refugees are to be dealt with, later than the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, 10 and 11, reception of women adherents about the same time as the preceding, verse 12 and 13. Relations to the Jews, to be broken off perhaps as alternative to 1. So verse 13. Well, some Jews, not all Jews. It's broader than the Jews. Stop making all comments about the Jews and the Christians. It's kind of, it does a disservice. But then again, I don't think Richard Bell was Muslim, so he didn't care if you went that way. But not liking the Jews in the 30s was, pretty common. It was like the standard thing, actually. So usually explained as attributing to their husbands children of which they are not the fathers, but this is uncertain. Any slander that these women, don't find a woman who's not going to slander people. And some of the slanders and deceits are about parentage. So yeah, you can be a stepfather, nothing wrong with being a stepfather, but a woman who knows and is honest about who the parent is, I mean, unless it's as a result of being victimized or something. I don't mean statutory, I mean like, actual rape or whatever, but so the retaliation isn't per se isn't for the fugitive wife per se, but it's when there's a war. And when there's a war, and then you go to war with the people where your wife ran off to and she ran off with your dowry, then those who've lost like that are, recompensed from that. The ties with the unbelievers, the wives who are unbelievers, mixed marriages are to be dissolved by the payment of dowries. Is it the misassociators? So the mere misassociators, people of the book, some of them are to be allowed, like some Christians or something, but the people who just merely are worshiping something other than God, that don't have a revelation-based thing, that they're following some ethnic way or something. So pay what they've expended. So yeah, sort of if a marriage is to be dissolved, a refund can be asked for the dowry or whatever. But if somebody becomes a Muslimah, they're not to be returned. You're supposed to keep them safe from the unbelieving people. That you don't send them back to their disbelieving husbands. Now there can be a wait period, right, where the marriage is suspended. If there's not another marriage started, the marriage could be suspended and picked up upon conversion of the husband. Now, some of these are not authentic conversions, but if it fulfills the outer requirements, who are we to say? A trial, uncertain object of persecution, you don't want to be the persecuted people. So anybody praying for difficulties so that they, whatever, yeah, you don't want that. If it happens, you make good use of it, but Surah 9, 115 people serving apart from Allah, also 1948, 26, 86. It's an interruption, so it's said by Abraham and his followers, but it brings the point home. The observation in the a Muslim in Medina had sent a letter to Mecca with information about the impending expedition. It was intercepted, and the man pleaded that he'd only intended to warn his family who were in Mecca. The observations indicated in 43 verse 25. The advantage being the next thing that I gave the verse from 915, 1948, 26. And so Surah 61, this surah consists of a number of unconnected pieces and is mostly early Medinan in date. Verse 9 and 13 may have been added when the passages were put together in verse 1, may also have been added then. Verse 2 and to 4 are generally taken as referring to the conduct of the Muslimin at Uhud, and if verse 4 belongs to the passage, it's probably right, but verse 4 has a slightly different rhyme and may have been separate. The rest of the surah is earlier than that time and perhaps earlier than the change of the Qibla. Verse 5, directed against the Jews, the descendants of those who have insulted Moses and rejected Jesus. The passage seems to have been in the prophet's mind when 9:29 was composed, and in 10 through 13, he seems to be engaged in persuading his followers to fight. Verse 13, which is out of grammatical connection, is probably a later addition. Verse 14 belongs to the same time as verse 5, where Muhammad is practically broken with the Jews, but is still more or less favorable to the Christians. Surah As-Saf, the chapter of the ranks, the glory of God. Verse 1, Muslimin professions not fulfilled. 2 to 4, opposition of the Jews, early Medinan. Verse 9, maybe later, but 5 through 9, Muslimin active in God's cause, early Medinan. Verse 13, maybe later, so 10 through 13, Muslimin to help Allah, early Medinan. Verse 14. And, okay. So the Gardens of Eden, Gardens of Delight, mighty success, incident and good success. Ibn Masud is said to have read, in which there are pure spouses for you, and in which you'll abide. I'm not sure where this comes from. A note on 32:29, but as this may be late, also 48:18. The helper, no, that's different. The clearing up. Surah 3:45, a wordplay on Nasara, the Christians, with reference to the Ansar, helpers in Medina, the helpers of Jesus. And Surah 2, 863 can be connected to the whole thing about why are people being insulted. Why is the prophet, Moses is saying, why do people insult me? And people are insulting Muhammad, and some, it got worse than insults, but praised, Ahmed is a meaning of Muhammad, probably based on Perikletos, comforter, John 14:16, with Perikletos, celebrated. So Ahmed can be said to be linguistically there. And there's over 10,000 variants. So, and we're talking a different language. So yeah. And the idea that it originated with Muhammad himself is unlikely, because it does seem that maybe that was part of John 14:16 in some version. And probably Jesus is one that, well, we're talking about Jesus saying stuff. So when Jesus came, they're like, oh, yeah, you're just working with spirits. Hence the Beelzebub talk in the Bible and whatnot. They call them a magician and all that. And Surah 62, this surah seems to consist of a number of pieces. Verse 1 to 4 belong to the period shortly before the change of the Qibla, when Muhammad is turning from the people of the book to the Arabs into this. Verse 3 has been inserted at some later stage. Verse 5 is little more than a scrap noting down a simile, which, however, does not seem to have been used again. It shows the controversy with the Jews, already fairly acute. Verse 6 to 8 also belong to the controversy with the Jews. In a more developed form, they have been used in Surah 2, verses 88. Verses 9 and 10 here are quite unconnected with and deal with the Friday prayer. Because see, it's talking about the congregational services. So it's on Friday instead of Saturday, the biblical Sabbath, and of course in Arabic the word Sabbath, but we don't observe a Sabbath per se. So and Friday is the day of congregation. But verse 9 and 10 quite deal with Friday prayer. But whether they mark its institution, it is unfortunately impossible to say. They seem later than the preceding verses. Verse 11 is evidently private and not really connected with the preceding verses, unless it be that they are the public exhortation induced by such conduct as this verse takes note of. Surat al-Jumu'ah, chapter of the Assembly, Muhammad's mission to those who have not received the book, early Medinan, 1 through 4, the Jews burdened with the Torah, which they do not obey. Exclusive claims of the Jews, 6 through 8, the Friday service, 9 and 10, Muslimin, disrespectful conduct, possibly earlier than preceding. Reverted is like a pun on the whole Yehud. No, not really. The Friday is the assembly day. And Surah 59 verse 23 also mentions this Holy One name. Surah 273 and 319 talk about the common folks. And Muhammad had claims the Arab tribes beyond Medina, adhere to them. And Surah 63. The surah consists of two separate pieces, have not much connection with each other, except that they both make reference to contributions. The first, verse 1 through 8, dealing with the hypocrites, is usually associated with the expedition against the Beni Mustaliq, on the return of which Abdullah bin Ubay is said to have used the expression referred to in verse 8. The date of that expedition is variously given. NS, what does NS stand for? No, it was something. Page 209, note 2, where the year 6 is preferred. The tone of the passage, however, hardly suits so late a date, and as a matter of fact, verse 8 is a substitute for verse 7. As the passage is addressed to Muhammad personally, it was possibly composed earlier, but not published until after the return from the expedition against the Mustaliq. When verse 8 was added, the second piece is addressed to the Muslimin and probably belongs to the same period as the other in its original form, say about the year 4. Surat al-Munafiqun, chapter of the hypocrites. The hypocrites described, 1 through 8, and people turning people away from the way of God. We find this mentioned in Surah 58, ayat 17 as well. We have an admonition to the believers, verse 9 through 11, and People want their death held back so they can do some good deeds. Do them now, right? Surah 64. The first part describing the glory of Allah might possibly be Meccan, but is more probably early Medinan. The same may be said verses 5 and 6, 7, 9, 10, which deal with the unbelievers. Verse 8 is certainly Medinan. It's probably a substitute for verse 9 and 10. The later may be a separate piece if the first clause of verse 9 can be taken as giving the time of what follows, but Arab commentators reject this and take it as connecting with verse 7. Well, it doesn't matter whether they're Arab or not, and if the commentators have access to the Arabic sources, okay, that's maybe why you should. But anyways, the close of the surah, verses 11 through 13 and 14 through 18, belong to the time shortly after the defeat at Uhud, when no doubt there was considerable misgiving in the minds of the Prophet's followers and reluctance to make further sacrifices. Surah At-Taqabbun, chapter of the overreaching, the glory of God, his power and knowledge, early Medinan, verse 1 through 4, former unbelievers overthrown, verse 5 and 6, fate of believers and unbelievers, 7 through 10, after Uhud, verse 8, misfortune comes by will of Allah, after Uhud, 11 through 13, the believers' temptations about the same time, so you beware of them. This may mean simply the preoccupation with their families is a danger for the Muslimin. You know, it's not about mere status or something, but the sense is probably more concrete. Wives were perhaps influencing their husbands against obedience to Muhammad's demands. Yeah, that's why you're supposed to only pair with certain spouses, right? And if the wives have their needs provided by the husband in terms of what financially comes into the house, you want that to be completely lawful. And how can you expect that from anybody who hasn't sworn to the Islamic principles, right? And what they're consuming and stuff. Why would they live a completely Islamic life in terms of their consumption and everything if they weren't Muslim? So the exact significance of the overreaching is uncertain. The word means defrauding or overreaching each other, you know, like the charging usury and various things, the driving up prices with their monopolies and all sorts of and the sense, fascism, communism, corporatism, you know, the sort of super left-wing stuff that we're, you know, overreaching. And the sense, perhaps, those who are struggling in this life and have the better of their opponents. Now, I don't mean left and right wing and some ridiculous thing of some political party or some country or not. It's not as simple as that, or not as complex as that. Either way you're looking at it, but to contribute would be better for yourself. So you contribute what is good for yourself. Give what is good when you're giving charity. Surah 65, the law of divorce, is here laid down, verse 1 through 3. Similar to that of verse 2. Surah 2, ayat 222. It's probably later than that passage. It makes fairly clear that Muhammad intended the iddah not as a period of waiting imposed upon the women after divorce, but as an interval between the expressed intention to divorce and the final carrying it out. Verse 7 through 4 to 7 or later addition, defining the length of the iddah and the treatment of women during the interval, verse 8 through 10 and verse 11, 12. No connection with the rest of the surah, except that it's part of the surah and maybe not. But anyway, maybe, you know, maybe he's not making the, he's not reasoning out why this is part of it. But, and belong to the earlier Medinan date. Their presence is probably due to their later, to 4 to 7 being with them. Okay. Well, yeah, if all these passages are with the passage, the verses that they're with, Surah At-Talaq, the chapter divorce, late 1 and 2. So the word iddah here generally is taken to mean their purification from their monthly courses, but it must mean the prescribed period of waiting. See Surah 2, ayat 228. Okay, well, it means it's the same thing. It's just the way you mention it. But it's a certain amount of such, right? So it's of a biological connection. Something may happen at the interval to reconcile the parties. So even if a divorce is called before the waiting period is, it's like, well, you know, if they start their separation and then get divorced, or if they get divorced and then start the separation, well, they can reconcile. And then the husband gives a dowry on top of that. So, but the matter may be formally recorded. It may not be, but it's best to record stuff like that. And it's best to avoid divorce. Don't make it just a saying, oh no, I've said it a few times when I got angry. It's like, yeah, work on that so you don't do that. Later, 4 through 7 of the same. Unbelieving communities punished, early Medinan, 8 through 10. Blessings bestowed upon believers, early Medinan, 11 and 12. So religious ordinance is where it's at, the fear of God. Ibn Masud is said to have read a prophet reciting to you the book which I have sent down to him, in which are the stories of the prophets which I have sent to people before him. They're just listing different ways to translate things, aren't they? But it sounds like there's like maybe a different verse or something in that space, but it's not. That's not what's being said at all. So yeah, 11, that's just another way of saying verse 11, that part of verse 11. The intervention of the law, you know, the affair descending, now so modified as to mean the revelation. And then we have the last one we have in this program. Oh, we have a bunch left to do, don't we? Surah 66. This surah is very disjointed and seems to consist of a collection of discarded passages of various dates. Verse 1 and 2 go together, but are addressed to the prophet personally, and they possibly were not publicly recited. It's very unlikely that 3 and 4 were not publicly were published. If recited at all, they were probably addressed to the two wives. They refer in all probability, as verse 1 and 2, also to the episode of Muhammad being discovered with Mary, the Copt, by Hafsa, in spite of having pledged to secrecy. No, well, they went off together alone, but they were married. So told the story to Aisha, but the matter where this Hafsa or Aisha, they are part of both interpretations of this chapter, which actually both things can be addressed here. But the matter is anything but clear in verse 3, so vague and silly, we might all, as vague, we may also suspect someone, Aisha, having parodied Muhammad. Verse 5 joins well enough in sense with the preceding verses, but the rhyme and different pronoun of address show that originally it belonged to some other context. Surah 33, 28. The rest of the pieces of which the surah is made up to belong to the early Medinan times. Verse 9 must be later than Uhud. The fact that the examples quoted in verse 10 through 12 are women might argue a connection between them and the beginning of the surah, but in language they seem much earlier. Surah At-Tahrim, chapter of the prohibition, the prophet not bound to promises made to his wives. That's not stating it right, but year 8 after the affair of Mary the Copt are the issue of the sweetened tea and the making fun. And so annulling the oaths, 591. So if you've sworn to do something wrong, like label something forbidden when it was not forbidden, you may not like to do something and abstain from it, but it's not the same thing as saying, oh, well, this is forbidden to me. Or perhaps the wife said, it's forbidden for you to have, then honey must be forbidden to you or something. But anyways, the avoided part, the usual explanation, Muhammad, in upbraiding Hafsa, had withheld the name of his informant. It looks rather as if he had given out his own version of the affair, the affair as in the business at hand. There's a pronoun plural and not dual. Well, dual is a type of plural. That if he divorces, if he divorces you women, he'll get better. People that are more prone to fast. Saw this thing about what Muhammad has drinks, a beverage at a wife's house or whatever. So usually chapter 9, 113 is related to the whole thing about the fasting and the worshiping. Surah 2, 22 can be related to the fuel of the people and the stones. You know, the law about punishing us in the hereafter that's some harsh stuff, man. Oh, I did not know we're going to be recompensed for what we're doing. Verse 7 joins in verse 6. Be taken as said as the angels as they cast unbelievers in the fire. So admonition of believers, 6 and 7. So repentance, 5 and 9. Unbelievers and hypocrites severely dealt with. Models of unbelievers and believers, 10 through 12. The books is in the book. Whether God's scriptures in the original is what we're called to believe in. What other people did to them that changed them, that's, if there was editing or mistranslations or something, that's not what we're believing in, right? So we breathed into them, into her, 2191, Imran, 330, 28:8, the wife of Noah, the wife of Job, no, but Noah and Job did have issue with their wives, and so did Lot. So I guess that's a third person. And 974, the bad destination. Verse 7, the 6 could be said by the angels as they're throwing disbelievers into the fire of hell. 222 is the people in the stones. And I guess I gotta stop here.